happy, impressive result that these new teaching methods are best equipping today's youngster for today's world. I'm Marshall Walton. To parent-teacher.
Classic. I don't know if you've seen that one or not, but it's a classic video, I think. But so essentially what's going on here is the application of Hegelian philosophy to education. If you think of it, rote learning is based on the idea that here's all the information and all you have to do is memorize it. But the laboratory school, if you take this dialectical process that we use in science, you have your hypothesis, you test it. If it doesn't work the way you expect, you have to go back and reevaluate your problem, come up with a new, right? So it's a dialectical back and forth process. And our growth, our learning, is also interpreted then as this evolution, and the evolutionary process is this dialectical process. So it doesn't help to sit in a classroom and be bored to death listening to the teacher, just trying to make us memorize stuff. Instead, as he explained, you retain it more if you're actively learning, basically going through this dialectical process yourself. So when you apply this evolutionary theory to learning, this is part of course, what happens. And it does transform not only the American educational system, but I mean, think of it. It goes from a one-room schoolhouse where everybody, all ages in the village, that are getting an education from what would almost be high school to kindergarten, basically all in one room, getting the same memorize this stuff. Instead, are put into age categories, the grade levels that we're familiar with. That wasn't always the way it was done, right? And now of course, you put people in a room where they can work together and study together and learn, solve problems together. And as they also pointed out, it requires a lot more skill and ability on the part of the teaching staff. It becomes a professional position instead of just any old person who can read and do math, show up and for 25 cents a day or whatever the money was, as long as they read the Bible and other good books, right? You instead now have a professional doing the teaching, because they have to study child psychology. They have to understand what level of ability the students are at, and they have to present them with adequate puzzles for them to solve that are of their age group, right? So you need a syllabus that basically is going to work this out. Of course, today things are much more complex, and we've got lots more things going on, but basically this was the significant change to do that. And it didn't just influence American education. Other countries were influenced by it as well. In fact, there's an interesting connection between Wittgenstein and Dewey in this regard, that Wittgenstein was primarily a mathematician, an engineer. His father wanted him to be an engineer and take over the engineering aspects of the family business. The Wittgenstein family was the richest family in Europe, maybe in the world at the time. And Wittgenstein's job was to study engineering and become that family engineer. He ended up getting interested in language, mathematics, by reading some new texts that came out by Bertrand Russell and others, and what he wanted to do was participate in that, and that's what drew him into philosophy, was the language analysis. And it was only later that he ended up starting to read other aspects of philosophy, Kant, for example. But as a philosopher, he really wasn't much of a philosopher. He was a language geek, basically, interested in logic and helping Bertrand Russell. But after he had finished his PhD work, that Russell submitted for his PhD, which was the Tractatus, that we have part one of the two texts that we have by Wittgenstein, and the text is an excerpt from the Tractatus. After that, he thought he had solved all the problems of philosophy, and so he headed off to war, basically. He ended up in World War I, where he was captured by the Italians, because he was Austrian, and they were fighting the Italians. And he ended up in a prisoner of war camp for a while. And it was there that he actually finished the work on that book. But it was after that was over, he ended up going to a teacher education program that was based on the work of John Dewey. And then he became a teacher in a rural Austrian village. By the way, it's not a good idea to have an autistic perfectionist teaching young children, especially in a society that believed in corporal punishment. So he literally went overboard, ended up knocking out one young farmer's daughter in class, and the farmers literally chased him out of town with pitchforks. So they had to run for it, or they would have poked him pretty good, I guess. And so he gave up teaching. But what's interesting there, the connection is that by studying how to think, one of the books from John Dewey, this is the Hegelian philosophical method of how one thinks, right? Which is based on Hegel's dialectical process. And so that's what introduced Wittgenstein to Hegel, was Dewey, and that transformed his own thinking about whether or not he had solved the problems of philosophy. He realized he had not. Some say that he completely changed his position. I would say that it basically just expanded his position, that he essentially still thought of language the way it was, but he ended up realizing that there were different language games, not just one. There's not just one universal language where we learn things kind of the way St. Augustine describes language. Instead, we end up with lots of language games where the meaning of a word is dependent on the context, the language game, etc. And that's a Hegelian difference, that we have all these different contexts and that meaning evolves and is connected to the particular situation that it's in, not just a universal meaning of the word, etc. So the connection with John Dewey and Wittgenstein, I think, is pretty intriguing and hidden. It's not the sort of thing that everybody is aware of. You have to kind of learn about how this connection, connect the dots and see how this works. Where did that come from? So the interesting thing about his time at the University of Chicago, it's where he started the Parent Teachers Association, the PTA. He's the one that invented that. Because it was his idea that parents ought to be involved in their children's education, and so on. So lots of developments there associated with applying Hegel's philosophy to the process of learning and education, and that happens at the University of Chicago. But notice, not everyone at the University of Chicago were happy with all of this. This was a revolution in educational work, and the conflict resulted in the head of the University of Chicago taking advantage of Dewey being in China, where the Chinese were trying to learn how this educational system worked, and not only did he travel to Europe, but also to China. And fortunately, none of his children died while he was visiting China. But while he was in China, the head of the University of Chicago, Hutchins, took the laboratory school away from the philosophy department and moved it into the School of Education, which makes sense. But that also meant that Dewey was no longer in charge of it, and that means, of course, that Dewey is basically out of a job as far as he's concerned. And so Dewey left the University of Chicago and took a teaching position at Columbia University in New York, where he spent the rest of his career until he retired in 1931. Remember, though, he lived till 52, and he continued to be an important lecturer all over the United States. In fact, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Dewey was actively, at the time, as the news came in, he was in the middle of giving a lecture, and he changed it once he heard the news, and of course, I remember seeing it on a video. I don't know how I would find it. I don't know if, could I find it? John Dewey?
Habits, customs, and institute modern events, and
okay, so I won't play it through, but obviously you could find this. I lucked out. That was pretty good. And listen to it, and you'd hear him lecturing, as it says here. This is on the evening of December 7th, immediately following news of the attack. So he was scheduled to give the lecture and still gave it, but of course changes it, as you could hear, to address the new situation. But so what's interesting here is, of course, this is obviously still within his lifetime, and so even though he's retired from teaching at Columbia, by then he's still actively out and about in the United States doing lectures and things of that sort. So John Dewey, a pretty significant American philosopher. Lots of good books out on his life, plus his own books, although his own books are considered rather boring. The prose is not the most exciting. I would say that Josiah Royce is absolutely amazing. I highly recommend reading the sources of religious insight. But Dewey's important, and if we look at some of his books, they are very readable. It's just they are where are they here? Publications. Okay, so how we think. Democracy in Education, that's pretty famous. Lots of folks are, I mean, there's that connection between a successful democracy and an educated citizenry. Experience in Nature, Public and Its Problems, The Quest for Certainty. I mentioned how with James, and not so much with Peirce, but the problem of truth. When you're a pragmatist, truth evolves. So how do you think about it? And the problem, of course, is we want to be certain about things, so the quest for certainty. How do we become certain about things? So art as experience, well, just look at these, have a look at them. They're in the libraries, we have them. Granted, they're not the most exciting logic, the theory of inquiry that lays out the whole process that is basically Hegel applied to problem solving. It's kind of interesting. So there, have a look at that. And good books, again, on him. There's one article that James writes where he's in Michigan. And notice, why would James be in Michigan? Well, Dewey was there. It seems to me that the reason you might be talking about being in Michigan out camping is because he's with John Dewey. And that's the one where he talks about the guys all sitting around the campfire, and some of them have walked off, and when they come back towards the campfire, they see this squirrel in the tree, and the squirrel is going around because the squirrel doesn't want to be looked at. And so the guys are going around the tree, and the squirrel's going around the tree. And then they get into this philosophical discussion at the campfire. Is the squirrel going around them, or are they going around the squirrel? And of course, James gives us the absolutely wonderful compromise that both are the case, which, if you wondered where did I get my earth go around the sun around the earth, that's James, basically. It's perspective. But it's also interesting to me, even though he doesn't mention Dewey by name, I'm pretty darn sure that he was camping with Dewey at the time in the woods. So that's just kind of fun. Okay, but I should move on. I did start talking about Bertrand Russell a little. And how do we do this? Do we do Wittgenstein first or Russell? Let's do Russell first. Oops, I went backwards. Go to, there we go. So, lots of things about Bertrand Russell. Born 1872, his father was an earl. His uncle, or his grandfather was an earl. And so he ends up, of course, being an earl. But just because you're an earl in England doesn't mean you're rich. I suppose he would have started out rich. His parents died. It's kind of a hellacious explanation of how they died. I mentioned that Bertrand Russell believed in free love and that sort of thing. Well, he got that from his parents, who believed that sex was important. And one of the things that happened was they had hired a math tutor who was, I guess, a genius to tutor their children. The problem was the math tutor had tuberculosis and had to even use like one of those pipes in his throat where he had a hole to help him breathe. But Mrs. Russell was absolutely convinced that it was important for the man's health to have sex occasionally. And so being a good mistress of the household, and her husband was in on this, thought it was important that the math teacher have a chance to have sex occasionally. And this guy has tuberculosis. So guess what? Both his parents end up getting sick. I don't know absolutely if it was tuberculosis, but in any case, they both died while he was young. And so he ended up living with his grandmother. And that was one of these absolutely horrendous situations because, of course, his parents are incredibly liberal beyond the pale, really. And the kinds of friends they have, etc., are, the crazy kind of, you know, liberals that do all sorts of weird things, dress weirdly, have weird ideas, etc. But once they're dead, he ends up in a home. It's just a mansion. It's the Earl, of course. But Grandmom is in charge, and Grandmom is Victorian. And so if you're familiar with Victoria in that time period, that's famous for the British sense of norms that are very, very, very conservative. And so it was kind of a hellhole for this young man and his older brother to be suddenly. It wasn't such a problem for the older brother because the older brother went into a boarding school. He was old enough to go right into a boarding school. But Bertie, on the other hand, ended up living in this huge mansion with a Victorian grandmother insisting on proper etiquette and everything else. He was so crazed by this switch in his life that he began keeping track of his memoirs. He wrote his memoirs down. And what was interesting about this was he wrote them in Greek, but in English. So he used the Greek alphabet, but they were in English. So that would have screwed up, you know, whoever would have, you know, been trying. So Grandmom couldn't read them, basically. And one of the things he says in these is that it was mathematics that kept him sane. From there, he went on and he studied mathematics with Sir Alfred North Whitehead, who eventually became his partner. And the two of them together wrote the famous Principia, which is the book that he's most well known for. And the Principia Mathematica was right here. Click on that. And this is the book that not only is going to attract Wittgenstein to study with Russell, but also succeeds even today. I think people are convinced that logic is the basis for mathematics, which is the basic argument of the Principia, the principles of mathematics. By the way, we have a complete set, the 3-volume work, in our library, but if you do check it out, please be careful with it. It is on the regular shelf, but the volumes, at least years ago, were worth $800, so please be gentle with them. You can buy the book popularly, although the variation that is normally out there, in fact, this one here is that one. It just goes up to 56, so it's not the whole thing. This is the shortened version. We have the full version there. This is the beginnings of what eventually becomes computer languages, things of that sort. So this is all, certainly interesting. It certainly does evolve. And of course, if you go and study computer languages today, there's no need for you to go and study the Principia. But if you're looking at the historical relationship, it's very, very interesting. And as I said, it's considered to have succeeded in demonstrating that mathematics is based on logic, although in a way it's also full of jokes. So for example, at one point the text says 1 + 1 = 2, or more simply, and then follows 3 pages of this kind of language to demonstrate that 1 + 1 = 2. So there's obvious humor in it as well. And by the way, famously, only 24 people have actually read the whole Principia, and most of them are dead. In fact, I think at the moment, all of them are dead. So that's kind of interesting. So that's kind of fun in that regard. But there are problems with it. So even though it succeeds in its task of trying to show that mathematics is based on logic, there are problems with it because it was meant to be a complete system. And Kurt Gödel, I should also mention Gottlob Frege. Let me put him up here real quick. So Gottlob Frege, I'm not sure, have you ever heard of him? Yes, a couple people. So he's involved in the same kind of attempt to complete a foundation of mathematics. His book is the Begriff Schrift. Now, why on earth would I get a phone call? Hello? Friendly reminder, my vehicle is no longer covered by its warranty, and how does this happen? I don't know. Okay, so I should also mention Giuseppe Piano, who is pretty interesting. He's the one, if you're looking at the axioms that are basic for mathematics, basically 0 is a number, and oh shoot, I don't remember them, my goodness. Where's his axioms? Let's just do it this way. Sorry if I'm boring you to death, but should we go to, oh, if we go to Wolfram, it's going to be too, oh, okay, there it is. I can make it bigger. 0 is a number. If whatever is a number, the successor of whatever is a number. 0 is not the successor of a number. So you put those two axioms together and you notice that means 0 is first, right? Two numbers of which the successors are equal are themselves equal. Each of these has a name, by the way. Induction axiom, if a set of numbers contains 0 and also the successor of every number in the set, the number is in the set. Peano's axioms are the basis for the version of number theory known as arithmetic, basically. So this is part of the process that's going on. Peano, Frege, and Russell. But Kurt Gödel points out to everyone, Russell especially, Kurt Gödel. And by the way, Kurt Gödel is one of the Jewish intellectuals that's encouraged to move to the United States. He doesn't really want to, he keeps staying, but basically he ends up kind of having to leave, and he ends up in Princeton, and in fact it's why Princeton created the Math Institute, and that was why Einstein moved there, so that he could be there with Gödel. And it was so the two of them could walk every day, talking in German back and forth from their houses, which were next to one another. And by the way, I have friends that know them, or knew them rather. They're old now. Eric Wolforth, Charles Wolforth's father, would see them there because he was at Princeton at the time. It's also interesting that Richard Rorty, who we will be talking about eventually, was a professor there at Princeton. And Richard Rorty once was seen by Rebecca Goldstein, who's also a philosophy professor and author, and wrote Plato and the Platypus, I believe, or something of that sort. It's a very popular book about Plato. I thought it was kind of basic, but nonetheless it was a bestseller kind of thing on Plato. She was there as a graduate student at Princeton, and the one day she was in the supermarket and she saw Richard Rorty standing there in shock. And she was worried about him, so she went over and asked him, is he okay? And Rorty looked at her and he said, I just saw Gödel in the frozen food aisle. which, like, you're, what? You can imagine this guy in the frozen food aisle? No, you can't, actually. As his wife did all of that stuff. The reason he married his wife wasn't because he should I say this? I don't think he loved her, but she was like a good caretaker. She took care of him, cleaned the house, made his meals. I don't know, but he was so dependent on her that he was afraid to eat any food unless she gave it to him. And by the way, he eventually starved to death. Although, part of the problem was she ended up getting sick and ended up in the hospital for a while herself. And so he was like down to 80 pounds or something. She did come home, but Einstein died earlier, so Einstein wasn't able to help in that case. So Kurt Gödel. But what's important was Gödel's incompleteness theorems. And so here's the problem. If you have, in set theory, which comes from the Principia, among other things, but set theory, you have the set of all sets that have one member. That's the definition of one. If you have the set of all sets that have two members, that's the definition of two. If you have the set of all sets that have three members, help me here, that's the definition of three. You got it. Boring? Yes. So what's the set of zero? Zero is the set of all sets that have no members, zero members. So let me ask you, is zero a set? Yes, it's defined as a set. So how many members are in the set of zero? One. So no, that's wrong. Zero has no members. No, it has one member. No, it has no members. No, it has one member. Right? So there's a problem there. So that's number one. But the other problem, of course, is, and this is, I think, true of all systems. We can also say axiomatic systems, and I'll explain one of what I mean by this. But specifically with arithmetic, it's based on axioms. As we see, P&O, for example, gives us the axioms, right? Well, what they're trying to do is create a complete system. The trouble is, when you get right down to it, axioms are absolutely essential for you to come up with the propositions that can be proved based on the axioms. But axioms themselves cannot be proved in that system. They're the basis for the proofs that you can build in that system. But axioms must be true in that system, but the trouble is you can't prove them in that system. By the way, there could be hierarchies of axiomatic systems, so you might have proofs for the axioms of one higher system in a lower system, but when you get right down to it, the bottom systems or whatever have axioms that cannot be demonstrated as true in that system, but must be true in that system. And so as a result, your proofs in that system are going to be incomplete. I've kind of given a very brief variant of how this works, because the whole thing is actually like 24 pages long, as I recall, and very dense. And he has to actually come up with what are called Gödel numbers, Gödel numbers, because he essentially defines things in terms of numbers and then uses those Gödel numbers to demonstrate that your axioms cannot be complete. So basically Bertrand Russell's and also Alfred North Whitehead's attempt at creating a complete system is a failure. At that point, it's not over yet. Of course, mathematicians have continued to work on this project, and yet at the same time, since Gödel has demonstrated these theorems seem proof that no system can be complete. And that's meant to be mathematical systems. However, I would take it and expand it further, although you would have to have a proof to show that this works. But hey, I don't need a proof. No one's going to give me grief. You're the only ones that are listening to this, right? And no one's going to watch the videos except one person who emailed me and said, I watched the videos, right? But here's the deal. If you're playing football, there are rules to the game. Those are the axioms of the game. You know how far you have to go in order to get a first down, etc. Right? You're not allowed to play outside the perimeter of the field, etc. Right? There's all these rules, right? But guess what? None of those rules can be proved as the true rules of the sport. You believe them and you play the game. You don't believe them and they won't let you play, right? So in other words, if you want to participate in the system, use the system or whatever, believe in the money, and then you can use it. If you go to a store and they're asking you for money, you say, I don't believe in money, they're not going to let you shop there, right? Same thing with football. You can't argue with the ref and say, prove to me that this rule ought to be a football rule. I don't like them. No, that's not gonna fly, right? In a way, the mathematical rules are the same. But it's not just there. So, for example, if we're watching Crimes of Grindelwald, for example, and Grindelwald ends the movie, warning, this is what's it called when you're running? Spoiler alert. Okay, so sorry, but here it goes. So Credence has all along been trying to find out who he is, and at the very end, Grindelwald says to him, "You're really a Dumbledore, and your brother's trying to kill you." Albus is trying to kill him. Well, wait a minute. We go back to J.K. Rowling's earlier books, and we read, Albus's, family consisted of his brother Aberforth and his sister, and his mother and father, and Percival was in Azkaban, and in other words, he couldn't possibly have another brother. And yet here's in a follow-up movie that's ahead, because it's a prequel, right? And you're like, wait a minute, he can't be Albus's brother because there's no gap where this, plus this is 1927, and by the way, there's another problem. Minerva McGonagall is in Hogwarts teaching in 1927, but according to the books, she's not born until 1933. You see the problem, right? So the world is upset.
Wait, is there time travel in Harry Potter?
There is. Is that what's going to happen in the third movie? That we're going to find out people go back with time turners to screw things up in the previous movies?
Maybe.
Could be. People were worried about that, though, because they hated Cursed Child, because that was totally destroyed using time turners back and forth, etc. Sorry, but yeah, hey, in any case, you get the problem. There are axioms that J.K. Rowling has set up herself in her own set of books, and by golly, she better abide by these. She can't just start changing things all of a sudden now. No way, right? So I would argue it's not just arithmetic that this is a problem for. This is the way basic human systems work. There's actually a big fight over how applicable this kind of issue is to what we mean by other systems. Are they axiomatic systems, and so on? I suspect that we do, as humans, apply the same kind of axiomatic system to virtually everything in its language game, its relative language game. Wittgenstein gives us the idea of grammar and rules. And when we think about Wittgenstein and his impact on Russell, I mean, he's a young guy. He approaches Russell because he's been an engineering student at Manchester. Even though he's German, he went to Manchester to study engineering flight. Wanted to learn how to do balloons at the time. Although while he was there, he invented a jet engine, which no one could use, because if you put it on those wooden airplanes, the jet would take off and the paper airplane would be still sitting there. So it was ahead of its day. But it was also during that time that he was reading Frege, Russell, and so he comes into Russell and he says, "Here, read this. And if it's any good, I'll be a philosopher. If it isn't, I'll be a pilot." Well, and so the next time Russell saw him, which was, I guess, soon, Russell said to him, "Don't be a pilot." And so Wittgenstein figured, oh, okay, so I'll be a philosopher. I don't really interpret it that way. I get the impression that Russell was figuring, hey, if he became a pilot, that could be dangerous, right? But Wittgenstein took that to mean, I'm going to be a philosopher, and basically camped out on Russell's doorstep. It became his German. It wasn't like he really even applied to be into the school or anything like that. He just started attending, and there he was. As far as I know, he didn't pay. What's interesting, though, is when his father died, he inherited maybe the equivalent to billions of dollars or whatever, and he didn't want it. In fact, he gave it back to his sister. So his sister had all his money. So you get the level of autism that he had. He didn't do money, basically. He must have had enough to go to the movies because he loved Westerns. So that's kind of interesting. I love the line where he's arriving on the 5:40 train or whatever, and one of the other philosophy students went to pick him up, and he reported that God arrived on the 5:40. So their collective feeling about this guy is that he's, whoa, what a nutcase, right? But as far as Russell was concerned, he was a genius. Puzzles me. What do we mean by a genius? How do you know? I believe you're a genius. I think you're a genius. I think you're a genius. I think you're a genius. I know you're a genius. So we've got, what do we mean by a genius? Plus, if you figure, well, you read his Tractatus, which was a work of genius, and now you know it, doesn't that make you a genius? Well, not really. I mean, we can all have the same appreciation of Einstein's geniosity. Does that make us a genius now? No. We have to be a new kind of genius for today. But that's a whole other thing. We can also say that, yes, you are a genius because you read Einstein and you know what only geniuses at the time understood, right? Makes sense to me. So I have no clue what a genius is, but everyone started treating him like one. But if you read his Tractatus, you're wondering, what's the big deal? The world is all that is the case. Well, that's silly. Of course it is. Tractatus. The world all is the case. Well, let's not do that one. So there are 7 statements in the Choctaws. I've got to quit, don't I? Shoot, can we pick this up next class? We can. But I need a quiz question for you. What is a genius? Am I right in saying that you are a genius? The problem, of course, is that if someone calls you a genius, your obligation as an American is to deny it. Because we also believe in being humble. And in fact, I'm the humblest person in the room, and proud of it, just so you know. That's a good joke, isn't it? Yes? Are you the humblest person here? No? You're not. Now my head is hurting because I'm trying to put that together. Okay, so what is a genius? What is a genius? Any questions for me? Was this fun?
Of course it is.
I did not record the video because